Okay. So for those who came a bit late and repeating, there was a problem in the quiz, in the first question. There was a blank which had to be filled, and then it connected increase in income with increase in money demand. But in the text, mistakenly, there was the word money supply. So I wish somebody had alerted me to that, but nobody noticed, or somebody noticed, but so I will have to give that to you, even if whatever you wrote there. Okay. You know, when you have the self-confidence to understand that something is wrong, even if it's in the quiz or in the exam, like if I say 2 plus 2 is 5, you know it's wrong, right? Whatever, if you see that, you know it's wrong. So similarly, if you see something and you know it's wrong, then that means you really, learned the stuff, because it goes beyond, and you have the sufficient self-confidence to challenge whatever you see. Now let's turn to the new lecture. So today I will talk about business cycles, and I will talk about attempts to explain the causes of business cycles. So we will look at the real business cycle theory, which is a major theory that has been put forward to explain business cycles. Then we will look at a case study, which is a supply-side shock, the oil shocks, which happened in the 70s and the 80s. Then we will talk about the Solow residual and the discussion about whether that really measures technology shocks or not. Then I hope to have time to also discuss the analysis that we already have done about the increase in government expenditures, but this time with an additional twist. We will also look at what happens in the labor market in that case. And finally, we will look at how the classical theory of macroeconomics explains unemployment. So let's get started. When we look at the economy, there are few things that we observe. First, at least ever since the Industrial Revolution, most economies in the world, actually almost all economies in the world, have been growing. Now economy basically is poorer today than it was like 200 years ago. They've all been on an upward path. Okay, so that's the long run trend is of a growing trend. That's one fact of the economy that we observe. Another equally important fact is that in the short run, there are swings around that long-term path. So you see that the economy will go down, there are periods of recession, and then we go up, there are periods of expansion, boom. And this is also another regularity that we observe. So we want to be able to explain that. So this is called, these swings of the economy around that growth path is known as the business cycle. It's a cycle, up and down. So there is a cycle made of expansion, which goes from when the economy hits bottom to when it reaches peak. That is the expansion. And the contraction is the opposite, when it falls from peak to the bottom. So that is the business cycle. So our objective, given this observation of reality. By the way, open another parenthesis. I saw still in the quiz that two people fell in the trap and shifted the IS curve. And I also saw horrifyingly that some people drew the IS curve as an upward sloping line. At least one person I saw did that. So that denotes that there is a need for, rehearsing the material quite a bit, because what we all know, that the IS curve is downward sloping. It is the Allen curve that is upward sloping. So let's close the parenthesis, go back here. We want to explain why these business cycles occur. What are the underlying economic causes? And also, is there anything that can be done to ameliorate them, to prevent the economy from going into recession? And because recession means, increase in unemployment and all that. So, and we want to see what are the economic models that have been produced to explain these things. Okay. So first let's look at what are the stylized facts. Okay, so number one, as I told you, we observed that on average, over the long run, GDP, which is gross domestic product, will be growing at an average of 3.5% per year. It can be higher, it can be lower because of the business cycles, but the long run average is around that number. Also, another thing that we notice is that consumption and investment, they move in the same direction as GDP. So if GDP is going up, is an expansion, then consumption and investment also go up. If GDP goes down, consumption and investment go down. However, consumption is generally much less volatile than investment. What does this mean? That the swings in consumption are much less pronounced. Those in investment are much more severe, as we can see from this graph. So here we have GDP growth rate is the blue line, and the orange line is consumption growth rate. You can see they go together, they move in the same direction. When I add the investment, why did it not come? Yes, here. The investment growth rate, the green line, you can see the direction is still the same. So it goes up whenever GDP is up and down whenever GDP is down. But the swings are much bigger, right? So it's more volatile. Another fact of the business cycle is that unemployment behaves in a counter-cyclical way, in the sense that when there is an expansion, unemployment falls. And if there is a recession, unemployment increases. This is actually quite an important relationship, so that it was even given a name by the economists that first uncovered it. It's known as Okun's law. Okay. So, we said unemployment is counter-cyclical. There are other variables that are typically pro-cyclical, which means they move together with the GDP. So we have already seen consumption and investment, but also, employment. Of course, if unemployment is counter-cyclical, employment, which is the other face of the same coin, will be cyclical, pro-cyclical. And real wages, also pro-cyclical. Also, remarkably, average labor productivity is pro-cyclical in the data. We will see that this is not intuitive, given that we know there are diminishing marginal products of labor. So as we add labor, we get less and less output. The contribution of labor to output is decreasing as we add more labor. In spite of that, average labor productivity is pro-cyclical, which means that as we increase production, average labor productivity goes up. Okay. Some other variables are counter-cyclical. Unemployment is one. The budget, the public budget deficit is another, because when there is an expansion, GDP is going up, then tax collection increases, so the budget deficit goes down. But when there is a recession, the tax collection goes down and the budget deficit goes up. Okay? So, now, let's look at theories that explain these business cycles. Why would these business cycles happen? What are the reasons behind them? Why the economy does not grow at a steady, smooth path? Why it swings around that path? So, one theory is known as real business cycle theory. According to this theory, these swings are caused by fluctuations in total factor productivity. They are basically shocks to the production function. Okay? And so if this is the case, then there is no role for the government to try and, decrease the effect of these business cycles. Because these are productivity shocks. Nothing can be done about them.
But we learned that automatic stabilizers such as direct taxes and transfer payments to unemployed people acted as like a soothing mechanism for the business cycle.
Yes, that is true.
Does that not apply here as well?
No, it does, in the sense that, no, it's the other way. So when you have a business cycle, so when you have a recession, then as I said before, you collect less taxes, for instance, and you increase also unemployment benefits, those expenses. So the budget deficit worsens. And on the other hand, it improves when you have the expansion. But we will come back to this, precisely this topic, when we will be talking about fiscal policy more in detail, which will happen after the spring break. We will talk about monetary policy and fiscal policy in much more detail. Then we will come back to this. Okay, so this real business cycle theory is due to two economists, Kydland and Prescott, 1982. And it's called real business cycle because it attributes the business cycles to shocks to the real side of the economy. First and foremost, the production function. Okay? Now this theory rests on another older school of thought, which is known as the classical theory of macroeconomics, which stems from famous, mostly British economists like Adam Smith, for example. Adam Smith or others, the most famous known one is Adam Smith. According to this classical theory, markets, including goods markets, including labor markets, including financial markets, they are always in equilibrium. They clear all the time. So there is perfect price flexibility, wage flexibility, interest rate flexibility, and according to this theory, output is only determined by the supply side. because whenever we produce something, that means that we are also getting the income for that production we have made. So whenever there is supply, there will also be demand, equal demand. So output is determined by the supply side according to classical theory. And changes in demand will only affect prices, will not affect output. Because of the fact that there is perfect price flexibility. I'll show you now a couple of graphs which will make this point clearer. Okay? First, so we assume complete price flexibility with classical macro theory. Look at this graph here. Here, this is an adverse demand shock. Okay? So we have a shift of the demand curve. Now, if we start from a point of general equilibrium at E, after the demand shock, if the price is fixed, we move to F, and we have the drop in output from Y bar to Y2. And then over time, we have seen what happens, that we are below full employment, so firms are not happy about that level of production. So what will they do? They will decrease prices, so this line will come down, we will move this way, and we'll go to H. So eventually, in the new general equilibrium, there will be a drop in prices, and we'll return back to full employment output. Now here, if the price adjustment is quick, we hardly spend any time at F. Due to the shock in demand, we go from E to H. There will be only a change in prices and no change in output. So you can see why, with complete price flexibility, a demand shock, a shock to the demand side of the economy, by which I mean a shock to things like consumption, investment, government expenditure, there will be no effect on output. The effect will only be on prices. However, consider now a supply shock, adverse supply shock. That means the full employment level of output will change. In this case, will decrease from Y1 bar to Y2 bar. So we'll go from E. At E, what happens after the supply shock? Firms are not happy about that level of production. It's too high. So they will want to increase prices. So as they increase prices, we'll move to F, the new full employment level of equilibrium, full employment level of output. Here, even if prices are flexible, we have a change in output. You see, due to the supply shock. Output goes down. Okay? So you can see that if you assume perfect price flexibility, the only type of shocks that can create the business cycles are supply shocks. Okay? Okay, now let me give you some examples of these supply shocks. What these shocks can be. They are generally, as I said, shocks to the production function. So they can be like development of new products or production techniques, new management techniques as well. Changes in the quality of capital or labor. You will say changes in the quality of labor, what does that mean? It means, for example, if you once I looked at the statistics of Singapore with respect to human capital, and when you see the percentage of people who have completed, who have gone to college, 30, 40 years ago was very low in Singapore, and nowadays is much higher. So that is a change in the quality of labor. Before, people were hardly had primary education over there, and now they have, they go all the way to college. Most people. So that's a change in the quality. Changes in the availability of raw materials or energy, and also good or bad, unusually good or bad weather. If there is a drought, for example, then that may create a supply shock. And changes in government regulations. So the phases of expansion, according to this view, will be created by beneficial productivity shocks, recessions, adverse productivity shocks. Okay. Now, this theory, the theory called real business cycle theory, is quite successful at matching what we observe, matching the theory itself with what we observe. Okay, so for example, it is true that if there are supply shocks, we would observe exactly the types of business cycles that we do observe. And also, remarkably, the theory correctly predicts that average labor productivity should be pro-cyclical. Whereas without making this assumption that, business cycles are due to productivity shocks, average labor productivity should be counter-cyclical given the diminishing marginal productivity of labor. Let me show you why. Let's look at this graph. Now, how do you represent on a graph the fact that there are diminishing marginal products of labor? You represent it with a production function that has the shape of a concave function, right? So it is increasing, but at a decreasing rate. Okay? That means there are diminishing returns to, marginal returns to labor. Now, how do we measure average labor productivity here? It's the slope of the line which connects the origin with the relevant point on the production function. For example, at B, for output level Y1 and employment level N1, the average labor productivity would be Y1 over M1, so it's the slope of that line. Okay? Now, if we consider a higher level of output on the same production function, then we see that average labor productivity will go down. It will become flatter, that line. So that means with higher level of output, average labor productivity should go down if we are on the same production function. But if we have a shock, like here, this is the technology parameter, if it goes from a given value to a higher value, so that we have a shock and the production function shifts higher, then we can have a situation like this, where here we have a certain level of output, there is a shock, so we move to a higher production function, higher level of output, but also higher average labor productivity. You can see the second line is steeper than the first one. So if you see this type of shock to the production function, which will shift the production function up, then you can explain the pro-cyclicality of average labor productivity. Without that, it's hard to explain, given the diminishing marginal product of labor. Is this point clear? Okay. Now, this is the summary of how this real business cycle theory performs with respect to predicting whether any relevant economic variable is pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical, and we can see that it does quite a good job in all cases. Okay, the only line where there is some controversy is the price level, because there is some data which shows it is counter-cyclical, like the model predicts, but some other data show that it is actually, price level is pro-cyclical. So if one were to accept that evidence, then the model would not make the correct prediction, since it predicts that it is counter-cyclical. Okay. Now, why is this still an open debate, that whether the business cycles are caused by supply-side shocks or demand-side shocks? Well, you know, there is a very famous event known as the Great Depression in the United States in the 20s and 30s in the last century. That kind of shock of, you know, the Great Depression was a great recession, was a more pronounced than usual business cycle. It was definitely due to demand. It was not due to any productivity shock, but the shock was clearly due to depression in demand, on the demand side. So that's where a school of thought started, which started thinking that business cycles may be due to demand side shocks. But after the Second World War, there have not been similar, at least before that financial crisis in 2008, there have not been other similar, you know, large kind of depressions. So it is actually quite plausible that the business cycles we have witnessed after the Second World War were actually due to supply-side shock, to shocks to the production function. One such case of a supply-side shock is the so-called oil price shock. Because, you know, oil prices, it's not like prices of any other good which are just made for consumption. Oil, it's used in the production process. It will increase the cost of, an increase in the cost of oil will increase the cost of production. So a change, a shock to the price of oil is a supply-side shock. It's a typical supply-side shock. So if we look at what happened in the 70s, oil prices went up 11% in 73, 68% in 74, and 16% in 75. So if we want to see whether the theory made correct predictions at that point, these are good to study because these are typical supply-side shocks. So is it true that they cause the business cycles as the theory would predict? So what happened? This slide is from Mankiw. Okay, we start from here, general equilibrium. Then we have the increase in oil prices, which causes an increase in general price level. So in the short run, we move from P1 bar to P2 bar. So we go from A to B. But at B, we are below the full employment level. Y2 is below Y bar. So there is a pressure for prices to go down. And therefore, as prices go down, we move back to A. Okay, so the theory predicts that first there should be a burst of inflation due to the oil price shock. There should be a reduction in output and so an increase in unemployment. But then things should go back to normal. Prices should come back down, inflation should go back down, and unemployment should also drop. This is what the theory predicts. So what happened in reality? Let's see the graph. We have the change in oil prices is the red line. Inflation first went up and then down, as predicted, as we saw from the theory. And unemployment, with a slight lag, it went up due to the oil price shock. And then it came back down, although not all the way. Okay? Now, so then there is a second shock in the late 70s. Again, we have the red line is the shock, inflation, up and then down, unemployment up. So kind of similar story. But then there is the opposite. In the 80s, oil prices fall. So this is now a favorable supply shock. Okay? So according to the theory, favorable supply shock, we should see fall in inflation and a decrease in unemployment. Okay, so these are the change in oil prices. Since this is zero here, it's falling all the time. It's falling more in 1986. Okay, and inflation is also falling, and unemployment is also falling. So again, it's according to theory predictions. Okay. So there have been only so many production shocks, observable at least. But we observe business cycles all the time. So some people argue that there are not enough productivity shocks to explain all the business cycles that we observe. However, people who came up with this real business cycle theory also simulated what can happen, and the simulation shows that even very small shocks, when you consider the cumulative effect of very small shocks, then you can produce the kind of business cycles that we witness. So we don't need to see, the oil price shocks of the 70s were very clearly big shocks, so people realized, were aware of those shocks. But we have small productivity shocks all the time. Changes in technology, production techniques, all that. All those shocks, even if we are not aware of them, most people would not be aware, they are still able to produce the business cycles as this simulation shows. Okay? Now, let's turn to our attention to the Solow residual. Now, in general, we are familiar with such type of production function. Output is a function of capital, labor, and some term A, which generally we call technology. Right? Now, the thing about this term is that we observe output. We can measure how much GDP is produced. We know exactly how much capital, what is the capital stock in the economy. We know what is the labor input like in the economy, but we cannot observe A. A is generally calculated as a residual. This is why it is known as the Solow residual. And it's calculated this way, just by dividing output by the measurable part of the production function. That's the residual. Okay? Now it is believed that this residual reflects technology. And when we look at the data, this solar residual is strongly pro-cyclical, at least in the US. So when GDP goes up, the solar residual would go up. When GDP goes down, it would go down. But there is a snag. This residual has also been shown to be highly correlated with things that have nothing to do with technology, like monetary policy and fiscal policy. So it's hard to explain why there should be a correlation between technology and monetary policy or fiscal policy. So people started to be suspicious that actually this residual might measure something more than just technology. Right? So we can see in the next graph how strongly pro-cyclical it is. The GDP is the black line and the other is the blue line. It's very pro-cyclical. But let's try and explain why it could be more than just technology. Okay, so, during business cycles, you can rewrite, you can think of production. When you think of production, you are using capital and labor, but it's not really obvious that you are using all the time all capital and all labor that you have. You may be using it in part. You may be using it more or less intensively, depending on circumstances, right? So how can we represent this in the production function? The fact that we are using capital and labor more or less intensively. So for example, here at LAMS, if we have high demand, many students want to come, all the, resources will be fully used. But in the events that there are few students, then you will see many places empty, hostels empty, and so on. So in this case, how can we represent the degree of utilization through these utilization rates, UK and UN, which is not United Kingdom, United Nations. It's the utilization rate of capital, utilization rate of labor. Okay, so if we plug them in the production function, this way. So now production is a function of this A term, then it's capital times how much we use it, like 70%, 80%, 100%, times labor, times how much we use it. So if we do that, then the solar residual will be equal to this. Will no longer be equal just to A, technology, but will be equal to a term which also includes the intensiveness, if you like, at which we are using capital and labor. And of course, those are very pro-cyclical, right? So we will be using capital and labor more intensively in expansions and less intensively in recessions. So even if if technology is not pro-cyclical, then we could still observe a very pro-cyclical solar residual due to these utilization rates. Okay, so it may not be necessarily true that changes in the solar residual are actually reflecting changes in technology, at least not only in technology. Okay, so finally let me show you this graph before we move on to another story, which is showing again the actual versus the simulated correlation between each variable and GDP. So you can see that the green bars are the actual correlations and the purple one are the simulated. In most cases, simulated get close to the actual correlations. So the predictions are pretty correct, except for productivity is much overestimated. So the correlation between productivity and GDP in reality is less than according to this model. Okay, now let me turn to studying again the effect of an increase in government expenditures. You will say, we have done that already, we know all the story, blah, 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 that if the government expenditure increases, what happens? The IS curve will shift to the right, and so on and so forth. So why are we doing it again? Because here we want to consider another important effect. So what we just described happens in the goods market, right? We have the shift in the IS curve, etc. Now, when the government increases government purchases, government expenditures, if a government goes on a spending spree, you as citizens may think that, wait a moment, if they are spending now so crazily, they have their constraint as well, just like the rest of us also. We are constrained, right? So that means they will have to collect taxes, more taxes at some point in the future, right? So we may make a connection between the spending spree and an increase in tax collection in the future. So if we make that connection, then we may think, wait a moment, if that is the case, we will be paying more taxes, let me work more so that I can make up for the decrease in disposable income that will happen due to higher taxes. So if we all work more because of that, then there is a wealth effect. And the labor, so in the labor-leisure choice, we'll be choosing to work more. That means that at each wage level we'll be supplying more labor, so the labor supply curve will shift to the right. And that means in equilibrium we'll have lower wages and higher full employment level of employment. That will be reflected in a shift also of the full employment line. So this is new. This is something we did not have before. This is a reading of the situation that includes this wealth effect, by which we also want to increase labor supply when the government increases expenditures. So if you are happy to buy this argument that people will increase labor supply when the government increases expenditures, then you should consider also a shift of the FE line, not just the shift in the IS that we are familiar with. And if that happens, then when everything is said and done, in the new long-run equilibrium, we'll have a higher level of output. You see, before, when we were just considering what happens in the goods market, at the end of the story, in the new long-run equilibrium, output would simply go back to the original level, right? We would not have an increase in output in the long term. The increase in output will only be short term. But due to this wealth effect, that would produce this new situation whereby even in the long term, there is now higher level of output. Because there is not just a shift in the IS curve, but there is also a shift in the FE line. So if you see what is happening here, we start here with this line, and this line. So we are here. Then we increase government purchases. IS shifts to this line, and FE shifts to this. So we move, where do we move? We move here. No.
So first there will be a shift in IS.
First there will be a shift in IS, so we'll move here, right? We'll move there. Then so that's the short run equilibrium. But the new FV line is here, so here firms will not be happy with the production level. They will want to decrease production and increase the price level. So that will cause a decrease in real money supply, shift of the LM curve, and we'll go here. So the movement is from here to here. You see R1, R2, R3. From here to here and then here. Can you see that? If there was no change in labor supply, we would go from here to here and then here. Okay? Now, one final topic I want to cover. We have seen that the real business cycle theory, which is based on the classical theory of macro, makes a good job at predicting procyclicality of average labor productivity. It makes less good job in predicting the fact that according to the classical theory there should be no unemployment, at least no cyclical unemployment. So how is it, but of course we observe unemployment in the real world. We all know there is always some people are unemployed, they cannot find employment. They are actively looking for work, but they cannot find employment. How do we explain that? How do we explain unemployment, even in the context of perfect markets that clear all the time and adjust very quickly? Perfect, full price flexibility, full wage flexibility and all that. How do we explain? According to the classical theory, unemployment in this context is due to mismatching. So firms are looking for some workers, but workers are looking for some other jobs. Like, for example, there are technology shocks that create new needs for firms. Like, one of the most fashionable jobs these days is probably being a software developer, But if you go and ask people, parents' dream is always for people to become doctors, engineers, lawyers. They would not think about, software developer or things like that. So there is this mismatch, which is increased at times of productivity shocks. And this would create unemployment and explain unemployment. Okay. Now, would that be able to explain? So, obviously, when there is a productivity shock, then the mismatch would be more. So, you would observe more unemployment. And so this would not be cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment meaning, excess supply of labor simply because demand is weak. So that will not be there. But is this convincing enough? Is this argument convincing enough? So suppose you have a recession, right? According to this argument, recession is due to productivity shock, supply side shock, right? So according to this argument, during this recession, there is an increased mismatch. So people and firms cannot find each other, cannot fit with each other, so there is an increased mismatch, more unemployment. So if that is true, you should see more job adverts, right? If you cannot find the right people you want to employ, then you try harder, you put out, in the media, here and there, job adverts to hire people, to find the professional figure that you're looking for. However, during recessions, we don't see that. We see job adverts going down. We can all observe that during periods of you know, when the economy is sluggish, those job adverts, they're not as easy to come by as when the economy is flourishing. So this means that it's not a problem of mismatch. There is cyclical unemployment, genuine sluggishness in demand, which creates, you know, that firms are not so keen on hiring people anymore. So even this mismatch argument is not able to convincingly explain unemployment fully and completely. Is this point clear? The difference between the mismatch, you know, why with new technology shocks we would have firms requiring some professions, people still chasing others, and so on. But in case of sluggish demand, then unemployment is simply due to the fact that demand is low. So we are not able to sell, so we don't want to hire new people because of that. Okay. So that's all I want to do today. Stop here. We have a class on Saturday, you know that. Saturday, 8 a.m. here. Yes, but that's the schedule. It's like the Tuesday schedule moved to Saturday, no change. So it's, I know it's early, but we'll enjoy the fresh air on Saturday morning.